Good evening, everyone. As the time is now 7 o'clock Eastern Time, welcome to another one of our Military Aviation Museum webinars. I'm your host, Keegan Chetwin, the museum director, and tonight we're going to be talking about Billy Mitchell and his Atlantic tests with our special guest joining us from Wisconsin. So with that said, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker tonight. Chris Kolakowski has been a guest speaker here at the museum previously. He did used to live here in the Hampton Roads area. He specifically spoke at a couple of different summer of flight presentations that were really well received during his time as the director of the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk. He's a reviewer and contributor to the Air Force Journal of Indo-Pacific Studies, and he recently moved to Wisconsin. He assumed the position as director up at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum about the same time that I arrived here at the museum in Virginia Beach. So Chris and I have never actually met in person, but he did great work with my predecessor, Jared, through the World War II Heritage Alliance that exists here in Virginia, which is a really great program. And so he's pretty much been up there since just before Christmas of 2019. So I hope you'll all join me in welcoming virtually Chris, who's going to take a look back at a really important event here in our region about 100 years ago that has some really interesting Wisconsin connections. So Chris, if you can hear us, we're ready for you to take it away.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be working once again with the Military Aviation Museum. I really was always been impressed with the operation that you have there, Keegan, and actually, when Jared and I had talked about doing this before he left for California, before I left for Wisconsin, doing something for the centennial of the Billy Mitchell tests and the bombing tests. And so it's great to actually be able to do that, albeit in a little different format and from a different place than was expected. But it's great to see the turnout tonight, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Veterans Museum, and we can talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A, we are the State Military Museum of the great state of Wisconsin. We're located in Madison, and we're an educational component, or the educational component, for the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs. And one of the things that we talk about, we showcase the stories of Wisconsin veterans from 1861 to the present. And we believe that every veteran is a story, and Wisconsin was there. This still matters. And so it's with those kind of themes in mind that we're going to talk about one of the more famous Wisconsin veterans in history, Billy Mitchell, and what he did 100 years ago this summer in the tests in the Atlantic in June and July of 1921. I've got a formal presentation that we're going to do, and then afterwards I look forward to a great discussion. And knowing some of the folks that are probably in the crowd tonight, I'm looking forward to a really good discussion once we get done. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get going, and we'll go from there. If you get nothing else out of this presentation tonight, I want you to think about these 3 points. The Atlantic bomb tests in June and July of 1921, the bombing tests off Cape Henry, about 50 miles east of Cape Henry, were a major aviation milestone. Much went into the tests, and from the tests, much flowed as well. And in some ways, you can still see their indirect effects, even today, both in the naval aviation, but also in the Air Force aviation communities as well. So this is a major milestone. It's not just a publicity stunt, it's a major aviation milestone and should be regarded as such. It also proved, the big reason it's an aviation milestone, but for many other reasons, it proved that the airplanes alone could sink ships solely from the air. This was the first time this had been done. It was also a personal triumph for Wisconsin's Billy Mitchell. And that personal aspect, particularly from our perspective up here in Wisconsin, is something that should be noted. And then the other thing is that it foreshadowed the future, and it impacted the development of American military aviation. So if you get nothing else out of this program tonight, those are the 3 kind of essential points of why what happened 100 years ago this summer matters a great deal. So before we actually talk about the tests, and before we talk about how they were conducted and what actually happened off the coast of Virginia in summer of 1921, let's set some stage, let's set some background here for the tests. 1921 is at the end of World War, or is just after World War I. World War I having ended in November of 1918. Powered flight has only been around for less than 20 years. It's been around for 18 years since the Wright brothers flew the first airplane in December of 1903. The Royal Air Force is 3 years old in 1921. The Air Force does not exist. It is the Army Air Service. It's just one part and one branch of the U.S. Army at this point. And it really, aviation, particularly powered flight, is still very much in its infancy. For those of you who are familiar with the collection of the Aviation Museum, you get a sense of that when you go to the World War I hangar out there, and you can see the technology is very much, that's the cutting edge of aviation technology in many ways, even in 1921 when these tests take off. One of the big other components to all of this is after World War I, there's a sense of retrenchment is the term that they use. We would call it today budget reductions or budget budget constraints, if you will. And the 1920 Defense Act sets a new structure for the post-war U.S. Army, but also sets a new structure for the post-war U.S. Navy. And basically what it does is it shrinks the defense pie from what it was even before World War I into what they expect will be what we would call after the Cold War. You probably have heard the term peace dividend. Well, this is, even though they didn't use the term, that's what basically it is. The war to end all wars has been fought and won in 1918 in World War I. So the idea of needing a massive military establishment in the future is just not something that the United States national mood is willing to support. Now, this matters a great deal because with the defense pie shrinking, it affects plans for all the services. The Army is having debates over the future of technology that had been revealed in World War I, things like the airplane, the tank, the internal combustion engine, trucks, mechanized warfare, things like that. This is about the time that the Tank Corps basically goes into hibernation for a while because of budget cuts, and people like George Patton go back to the cavalry. Billy Mitchell, who is the deputy director of the Air Service, is advocating very strongly for increased, in fact, he's advocating for an independent Air Force, just like what the British have, and realizes and is advocating that the airplane in future wars is going to be a decisive, if not the decisive tool, the decisive weapon in future warfare. So it's a big strategic debate within the Army over how to structure itself and how to prepare for whatever the future may be in the next 10, 15, 20 years. On top of all that, the United States Navy is undergoing a major naval expansion, partly fueled by the 1916 Naval Bill, which had started really modernizing and expanding the Navy, and was really, had it gone through, would have made the United States Navy the most powerful in terms of number of hulls in the world at the time. Excuse me. So you've got naval expansion on one hand, the Navy's trying to expand. On the other hand, you've got the Army trying to figure out what it's going to be in the future, both from an air-ground perspective. And you've got all of these plans colliding together in the defense, in the constrained environment of the 1920 Defense Act. The Navy realizes that Mitchell's arguments and the arguments of the Army for air, and there are naval aviators as well that are pushing these arguments, might be a threat to the expansion of the surface fleet. So they very quietly in the late summer of 1920, off of Tangier Island in Chesapeake Bay, anchor an old battleship, USS Iowa. And they run a few bombing tests on the Iowa to see what the airplane really is, and try to do some experiments. Like I said, they do it very quietly. They involve some Marine and some naval aviators, just doing some tests just to see what's there. And then at the end, Wisconsin native William Leahy, he grew up here, will conclude, he'll summarize in the report, he'll say it is impossible for airplanes to sink ships. Well, that report gets leaked to the press and gets leaked to Congress. And very quickly, it becomes clear that it wasn't a real test. What the Navy had been using was they'd been using low, slow biplanes. More importantly, they hadn't been dropping real bombs. They'd been dropping either concrete bombs or basically big sandbags with the weight of bombs onto the Iowa. And the idea was to hit the targets. They were measuring more precise bombing than anything else. But it didn't really prove anything. In fact, the only damage it did to the Iowa was a few dents here and there in the deck. It couldn't have done anything more. And so there are a lot of people, and of course Mitchell seizes on this, and a lot of the air power advocates seize on this and say, this isn't real. You can't say that without using live ordnance. Congress gets involved. And in the early months of 1921, as the Harding administration takes over from the Wilson administration, passes a resolution basically demanding the Navy do a real test, use live ordnance, use modern ships, and use surplus ships, and let's see what really is possible. Let's put this to the test. These tests are going to be planned for the summer of 1921 with some follow-ups later, which we'll discuss in brief. But the main focus of this presentation tonight is what happened in the summer of 1921. So that's how we get to the tests. That's how we get this set up for the summer of 1921. Now, having explained the background, let's talk about what the Navy, because the Navy will run the test. Let's talk about what the Navy is going to do and how they're going to structure this. And then we'll look at who's involved and a little bit more, some of the details as we set the stage, if you will, for what's going to happen later in the summer. The plan is this. They're going to anchor several captured German ships 50 miles east of Cape Henry and Cape Charles. So in other words, 50 miles east of the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. They're going to run a series of tests over a series of days that are going to involve attacks on the ship. They're going to involve strafing attacks, bombing with various sizes of bombs. I'll show you some of that here in a few minutes. The Navy views this, and this is important, the Navy surface fleet and most of the Navy establishment views this as much or more as an ordnance test to test what modern bombs are capable of against ship designs. The air people want to sink the ships. So almost immediately you have a bit of a conflict of objectives. But everybody realizes there's value in testing strafing and bombing and doing a methodical operation against these ships to see what's really possible. People still really don't understand or don't have a concept yet of what's really possible. So they're going to do that. They're going to start with lighter ships. I'll show you the ships here in a minute so you'll see what I mean. And then they're going to go progressively heavier and basically have one of each major type of ship that are available in the fleet at the time. After each major attack, they are going to do this methodically. As I mentioned, after each major attack, naval observers will go aboard, assess the damage, see what happened, and try and get some sort of sense as to what might have happened had this been an actual wartime condition. And so the Navy's planning a very methodical sort of scientific experiment, if you will, in some ways to see what would happen. The German ships that are going out on a one-way ticket. In fact, the entire Atlantic fleet is going to be out there to both observe, but also in case something doesn't work, in case the planes can't get the job done, the Atlantic fleet battleships are there, and some of the battleship gunners are preparing and are itching at the prospect of getting some gunnery practice in. And last but not least, this test has a lot of visibility to it. The press covers it. Mitchell has cameramen with him. He's got video. There's video on the ships. The Navy didn't really want that, but the Army most definitely did. There's also VIPs, senior officers of the Army and the Navy, the secretaries of the Navy, Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Navy, various other politicians, senior admirals, senior generals. A lot of people are going to be here for this. This is a visibility. This is a major test, and everybody is interested. There's a lot that everybody realizes is going to flow from whatever the results may be. And so there's a tremendous, tremendous amount of interest. Now let's talk about the targets. Let's talk about who's involved here. You can see the four ships that are involved, as I mentioned. US U-117, a submarine, which had actually done a lot of damage to American commerce off the East Coast during the First World War and then surrendered after the war. Destroyer G-102, armored cruiser Frankfurt, and the battleship Ostfriesland, the last two being armored, the other two being unarmored. All of them are combat veterans, and all of them had been surrendered by Germany in 1918. And this next bullet is important. There's a lot of misconceptions about these ships. A lot of people say, oh, Billy Mitchell sank old battleships. The targets that were here were old ships. They were worn out. They were useless. Quite the contrary. All of these ships are 10 years old or less. They are extremely well built. They have all survived combat, as I mentioned. Several of them, particularly Frankfurt and Ostfriesland at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, had sustained damage. Ostfriesland had been holed in the hull by a mine, still made it back safe and sound. Anybody that studies the German Navy in World War I, as I do, actually, I have a great grandfather who was being shot at by the German Navy at Jutland aboard HMS Caroline. If you study naval war in World War I, you realize that German ships were some of the best designed and some of the best built of any of the combatant warships. These are thoroughly modern ships. They stack up very well against American ships of like type. The last point that I would make as well about this is that these ships, even unmanned, even just anchored offshore, are still extremely well designed. The German design philosophy, particularly for their battleships, was to stay afloat. You can have all the guns in the world you want, ran the thinking, but the primary objective of a battleship, and to a lesser extent an armored cruiser and other types of ships, was to stay afloat. If you don't stay afloat, you can't accomplish any mission. So the German designs actually were some of the best in terms of creating watertight compartments, being able to control flooding, even innately within the design. And so from a naval architecture standpoint, these are some revolutionary ships. These are not old ships. These are not worn out ships by any means. These are worthy targets and worthy measures for the flyers to take themselves against. And so that's something that I want to make sure is clear. When you consider these tests, consider the targets. A lot of misconceptions, but there's more to it than what people think. So who's going to be involved in the tests? Well, most prominently, most people are probably familiar, if you are familiar with these tests, you know Mitchell was involved from the United States Army. They create the first provisional air brigade, and they basically grab most of the available air service forces and bring them to Langley Air Force Base. 125 planes, I'll show you pictures of a couple of them here in a minute, and 1,000 personnel under the command of Mitchell, who is still the Deputy Director of the Air Service. Not so well known is that Navy and Marine flyers were also involved, and were not under Mitchell, but they would be acting in concert and in coordination with Mitchell. You can see they're dropping a variety of different bombs. I kind of averaged out the types. Some bombs would be 100 pounds, some would be 600 pounds, but this is basically, you can see, and they're going to go from small all the way up to large as they go. They're based at Langley Field, as I mentioned. One of the things that Mitchell realizes as he's starting to train and he assembles his crew by May of 1921, and as they train, as they go out of the Chesapeake Bay and they begin to bomb battleship silhouettes painted on the beach, for example, they go out and bomb islands, they go and bomb sunken wrecks off of Tangier that had been sunk in gunnery exercises and things like that. One of the things that Mitchell realizes is what he terms the water hammer effect. You can strike the ship directly, and that can work, but you can do as much damage, sometimes even more damage, if you strike right next to the ship. And the force of the explosion, kind of like a depth charge against a submarine in World War II, creates what Mitchell calls a water hammer. You explode next to and slightly below the ship, and the explosion blows up into the hull, which tends to be more or less armored than the top part, which is designed to repel shell fire. And so that's something he trains his people on as well, is even if you can't hit the deck, a near miss is as good as a hit because of the water hammer effect, as he calls it. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing that they realize is the bomb sites are very primitive, so level flight for level attacks on these ships is not really an effective tactic. So they perfect dive bombing at 60 degrees, dive in at 60 degrees, drop the bomb, pull out over the top. Again, very familiar for students of aviation in World War II, but this is one of the first demonstrations that they will put on of dive bombing. And they train this, attacking these dummy targets throughout the Chesapeake Bay in the weeks before the tests begin. Everybody understands the importance of the test. Mitchell works himself basically to the bone, and at the end has infused everybody in the Provisional Air Brigade with the importance of this and the importance of this to the future of aviation and the future of a potential U.S. Air Force, Air Corps, whatever it may be. So that's who's involved in the test. That's the forces. Let me show you a little real quick some of the planes. These will be the main bombers that are used, the Martin MB-2, which is the most modern bomber in the inventory at the time. You can see they're loading ordnance there at Langley before one of the test missions. This actually is a U.S. Air Force photograph, but that gives you an idea. Twin engine bomber there, carries one bomb underneath. And then they'll also fly DH-4s, which will take care of the strafing runs, more of a biplane fighter. Very similar, again, to what was flown over France. These planes are starting to become borderline obsolescent by 1921. But those are the two, the DH-4 and the MB-2 are the main types of aircraft that Mitchell will use over the ships. And the same is true, by the way, of the Navy and the Marine Corps flyers, although they'll also use some seaplanes, some early versions of seaplanes as well. So, but there's some DH-4s, and just to give you an idea, this is over Langley Strip. And in the lower left-hand corner, you can see some of the hangars and get an idea of some of the base infrastructure. Hopefully my cursor is showing up and you can see there in the lower left. This gives you kind of an idea of what Langley looked like. Sure looks a lot different today, of course. Let me run through, we've been talking a lot about people and things. Let me talk real quick about, about machines, ships, things like that. Let me talk a little bit about people. Of course, the leader in this, and probably the name that comes up first in these tests more than anybody else, and I've used it tonight, of course, is Wisconsin's Billy Mitchell. He was born in Milwaukee. Father was a Civil War veteran. Had served in the Spanish-American War very briefly in a Wisconsin infantry unit, then was commissioned in the regular army. It flew. Experienced air commander in World War I, had led the largest air offensive in history up to that time in support of ground offensives at San Miguel and Argonne. After the war, is the most experienced American aviator, leading light for aviation, still today, inspiration, in some ways godfather to the United States Air Force. It's impossible to overstate his stature in the development of aviation and his importance in the aviation. His mouth can get him sometimes his own worst enemy. That's one of the reasons why after the war he's never actually chief of the Air Service. There's always somebody over him to kind of keep a thumb on him. And of course it will get him into trouble in 1925. But that's a whole other talk, Keegan, perhaps for a whole other time. But here in 1921, Billy Mitchell, there's one person in the Army Air Service that's going to lead these tests. There's really only one serious candidate for that, and it's William Mitchell. And so here he is. Dies in 1936, buried in Milwaukee. The Milwaukee Airport, for those of you who have ever flown through here, is named Mitchell International Airport for Billy Mitchell. So he's still a very big name up here in the great state of Wisconsin. There are some other people that are here, some people you may have heard of, and I want to run through some of those right now because, again, Mitchell is a very important name, but he's not the only name involved in these tests that will later be prominent as well. One of the pilots is H Arnold, Henry H. Arnold, who later, of course, will become chief of the Army Air Corps and then the Army Air Forces and lead them through World War II. He'll later become 5-star general of the Army and then, of course, join the Air Force when it becomes independent. It is the only 5-star general in Air Force history, general of the Air Force. If Mitchell is the godfather of the Air Force, in many ways, H Arnold is the father of the independent Air Force. And so these two very important figures in the development of an independent Air Force are right here at the tests. Another one is Clayton Bissell. A lot of people may not really know Clayton Bissell. He commanded 10th Air Force, 1942 to 43. He was one of the flight leaders, one of the prominent officers involved in the tests on the Army side as well. If you know anything about the China-Burma-India Theater or know anything about the Flying Tigers, they have their run-ins with Clayton Bissell, and it's Bissell's 10th Air Force that helps support them and work with them to the best of their ability. But he's a major player in the war in Asia in World War II. Sinclair Street is Mitchell's rear seat observer. And later, as you can see, commands 13th Air Force in the Pacific, 1944 to 45. After the war, he is one of the key players in developing Strategic Air Command. And it's through Street that you can draw a direct line from Mitchell through him to the B-52 force that still is on duty today as part of Strategic Air Command's successors. And so this, again, is another tie to the modern Air Force back to the tests of 1921. So, but he'll be Mitchell's rear seat observer through all the process of the tests. Senior Marine involved in the tests is this man here, who happens to be one of the Marine generals I have a great deal of admiration for. Roy Geiger is one of the Marine aviation pioneers, and later is probably best known for his time in World War II when he commanded the Cactus Air Force on Guadalcanal, and then later the 3rd Amphibious Corps in the capture of the Marianas, the capture of Peleliu, and then the Battle of Okinawa. And after the death of Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. in action in June of 1945, he's the only Marine to ever command a numbered field army, 10th Army, for 5 days, and then he's replaced by General Joe Stilwell. And he'll be the Marine observer for the surrender of Japan in 1945. Fascinating character, and like I said, senior Marine aviator in the tests. His deputy is this man, Francis Mulcahy, who is the 2nd-ranking Marine aviator in the tests, later commands 2nd Marine Aircraft Wing and the 10th Army Tactical Air Force in Okinawa later on in the war, and be a key air commander during the Battle of Okinawa. So these are the 2 senior Marine aviators. And then among the naval aviators, there's this guy, Felix Stump. Many of you probably have never heard of. He's kind of a forgotten light, if you will, in the development of naval aviation. He's a carrier commander during World War II. He's a task force commander, 1944 to 45. If any of you are familiar with the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the battle off of Samar on the morning of the 25th of October, when 3 groups of jeep carriers are surprised by Japanese battleships. The overall commander on the American side of those 3 groups of light-skinned escort carriers, or jeep carriers as they're called, is Admiral Stump. Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3 is what the groups are known for. And Taffy 3 did most of the fighting. But the overall American commander that got other airplanes and helped try and coordinate a defense was Admiral Stump, and he gets the Navy Cross for it. He'll later command 2nd Fleet at Norfolk, as you can see, in the early 50s, and after that become SINCPAC later on, before retiring in the late 1950s. But he'll be a flyer in these tests as well. So those are some names you may recognize for other reasons. They're also here 100 years ago this summer. Let's get to the tests themselves. Round 1 is June 22nd. There's U-117 taken from the air just that morning, just before she is going to be bombed. The Navy draws the first round, and actually what they will do is they'll send out a group of seaplanes, 3 seaplanes, and they will fly level bomb right over the submarine, drop 3 very small spotting bombs, basically to gauge wind, turn around, come back, and then they will each drop 3 bombs in succession that land right around the submarine. And within 15 minutes, U-117 is gone. The speed of that shocked everyone. Mitchell was watching it from above as well. He knew what was happening, but for everybody on the observing ships, it was amazing. It amazed them how fast the submarine went down. It's not that big a surprise to us when you consider World War II and what happened with Allied air attacks against U-boats, or what happened with Japanese attacks against American submarines, USS Wahoo being one of the more famous ones. But in 1921, that is unknown. Nobody's ever been able to sink a submarine from the air, even in non-combat conditions. And when the sub went down that fast, it shocked everyone. After a few days, a few weeks, they decide to go after G-102. Now, Mitchell has been given a free hand in how to attack the destroyer. And he decides he's going to try and demonstrate and try and experiment with the full capability of the Provisional Air Brigade. And so he sends out a 2-wave attack. The first wave will be basically the DH-4s, the fighters. Whole point, strafe the deck, drop light bombs on the deck, and try and see what machine guns will do to ships. In other words, sometimes what the modern term we'd use is mission kill. You're trying to get a mission kill. If you can kill the captain and shoot up the bridge, you might knock a ship out of action before just as easily as if you were to sink it. So they make a two-wave attack on the G-102. In the morning, out come a squadron of DH-4s. They bomb and strafe the G-102 and basically make a mess. And then in the early afternoon, out come the MB-2s with 500 and 600 pound bombs. And they launch several dive bombing attacks. They usually will bomb, and they'll do this throughout the tests. They'll send 2 or 3 in on a bomb run, wait a minute or two, see what the results of the previous run become apparent, and then send in the next wave. And that's what happens here at a G-102. They attack her very quickly. The water hammer has its effect. They actually drop a bomb down her stack. She blows up in half, and after about an hour's worth of that attack, is sent sinking. And you can see this is a picture of her sinking here. Yes, she's on fire. That should tell you something. Even with no fuel oil, with no munitions, still managed to set her on fire, and there she goes. Those have been unarmored ships. A few days later, the Navy, the Marines, and the Army go after their first armored ship. That's Frankfurt, and you can see her right here with a bomb impacting here as well. This time, the Navy and the Marines are given the role of what the DH-4s had played against G-102. And that morning, they bomb and strafe her quite a bit. And actually, I believe, although I'm not sure, I believe this photograph, if you study that ship very closely, it looks like the Marines and the Navy have done their work, and they've made a mess of her superstructure. But you'll notice she's still floating. She's still there. And so in the afternoon, with 1,000-pound bombs, the Army, the Provisional Air Brigade, go after Frankfurt. And the Navy had been afloat or been aboard her and had seen what the damage was and had assessed. Mitchell flies out, has to buzz a little bit while the Navy finishes their assessments, and then in the afternoon launches his attacks. Frankfurt lasts less than an hour, and she is sent to the bottom as well. So 3 ships, 3 targets, 3 sinkings. But that still leaves the biggest prize of all, Ostfriesland, the battleship Ostfriesland. And here she is on the eve of the final test. And you can see they've painted targets and aiming points various places on the deck, both on the bow and on the aft turret here on the stern. And then there's also aiming points as well on the mast. And this is also to help try and evaluate the trim of the ship from afar. But that is Ostfriesland there. That is the prize. One of the more modern battleships, only 10 years old. And a battleship that stacks up extremely well against what's in the American fleet today. Everybody understands this litmus test. Mitchell put it best. This was our real test. If we could not sink this great ship, the efforts against the other smaller vessels would be minimized, and the development of air power against shipping might be arrested, at least for the time being. Everybody understands what the stakes are, both in the air and on the sea. First round is July 20th. The Navy and the Marines also get the first shots. This is part of their attacks here. They go in with 100-pound and 200-pound bombs, strafe the deck, bomb the deck. You can see this is from some of their strikes, air strikes here. This is what they do that morning. This is what it looks like that afternoon when the inspection team goes back ashore. You can see they've made quite a mess of the deck. They've also damaged the aft turret. They've damaged some of the starboard side turrets. She's got a bit of a list to port. You'll know if you look real carefully along the waterline here. This is pretty much a mission kill. Ostfriesland is taking water. When Mitchell and his bombers will go in a little bit later, after the first inspection, they will do some damage as well. The water hammer will do its work, although many people, observers, will say, see, the battleship's still afloat. But the observers will notice that there are a lot of seams that are broken, a lot of the welds, a lot of the rivets have been broken, and Ostfriesland is taking on water. And you can see it even here, the trim is happening. The battleship's a mess. This is effectively a mission kill. Although she can get home, they freely admit with good damage control, Ostfriesland would make it back to port. So, but this is the situation, and this is what the ship looks like on the evening of the 20th. You'll notice, by the way, not just the turrets, the deck. A lot of this is deck plate that has been pushed up or bent up by bomb strikes, either from the Navy or the Marines, or also from Mitchell's flyers as well. So this battleship has been seriously wounded, and it's been wounded. She's been wounded in particularly below the waterline as well. So, you know, the water hammer's working. The next day, Mitchell and his crew come back with big bombs. First, 1,000-pound bombs for the first strike, and then you'll see a little bit later they'll hit her again with 2,000-pound bombs. This is the first strike of the day. Two MB2s have gone in, and you can see the effects. One bomb strike off the port, one bomb strike off the starboard side, both near misses. One actually bounced off the Ostfriesland herself. The water hammer underneath is hitting that hull from both sides, and it's really pushing on it and starting to crumple the hull like you would a soda can today. This is what Ostfriesland looks like late in the morning, and the ship to the left is the flagship for the tests, USS Shawmut here, which steams over in the intervals between strikes and puts the observers aboard. And now the observers have come off and they're getting back, and Shawmut is steaming away back to a safe distance. But you'll notice here Ostfriesland, you'll notice her trim, her bow is a little bit more out of water than the stern is. The port side, she's listing to port, and you'll also notice how dark the back section is. That's scorching. That's damage. That's a lot of serious working over by the planes. In fact, the observers, when they went ashore or when they went aboard, when they came back, they reported if this was wartime, first of all, she's out of action. Second of all, there's very little chance she would get back to port. She's that badly wounded at this point. So not only do you have a mission kill, you've effectively mortally wounded the battleship already. Early afternoon, Mitchell and his second flight of MB and another flight of MB2s, 12 of them this time, carrying 2,000-pound bombs each, will arrive and will launch another strike on Ostfriesland. And with Mitchell observing, will make their attacks. And you can see here again the water hammer at work. You can see here again direct hits on the battleship. As a matter of fact, Mitchell will call off the second half of the strike. Only 6 bombs are necessary. And he said when the 6th one went in, he said and as he would write later, when a ship is dealt her death blow, it is immediately apparent. And he saw after the 6th bomb had gone in that Ostfriesland was done for. She begins to list to port. She begins to sink by the stern. And with everybody watching, she begins to roll. And she goes from level, listing to port, over on her side, and then over on her back. Stern drops, the bow claws at the sky, and then she's gone. As this happens, Street unbuckles himself from the back seat of Mitchell's plane, stands up and waves his arms, starts cheering and yelling and yells, "She's gone, she's gone," as Ostfriesland disappears below the waves. Billy Mitchell and his flyers have done it, and they have done something that nobody said or that many people had maintained was not possible, but they had done it. Mitchell realizes the gravity of what he has just done. He actually admitted later to being kind of emotional at the moment. He said, "We wanted to destroy her from the air, but when it was actually accomplished, it was a very serious and awesome sight." He knows what he has just done. To celebrate, he buzzes the VIPs aboard the transport Henderson. And this is a photograph of Mitchell buzzing the VIPs. And you'll notice some Atlantic Fleet ships visible here in the distance off here to the right. But here's Mitchell buzzing them. And if you look real carefully on the deck, you'll notice a variety of reactions. Many people are cheering. Some people are waving their hats. There were several admirals, particularly surface fleet admirals, who were openly weeping and had openly wept at the death of Ostfriesland. because they knew the impact. They felt the impact of the power of what had just happened. That's where the title comes from. The Admirals Wept is this documented moment here where admirals are weeping aboard the Henderson. Billy Mitchell has done it. His flyers have done it. Their theories have been validated. Their techniques have been successful. And that night, they throw one heck of a party at Langley to celebrate. This is an incredible moment and has been called, I think correctly, the high watermark, the high point of Billy Mitchell's career as an air power advocate. I think that's absolutely true. I mentioned some later tests. These will occur in September 1921 in the Chesapeake Bay with USS Alabama. That's a photograph here. And then in 1923 with USS New Jersey and USS Virginia off Cape Hatteras. In both cases, they will test gas bombs, white phosphorus bombs. That's actually one of Mitchell's planes dropping a white phosphorus bomb on the mast of the Alabama there to test the effects of incendiaries, to test the effects of gas on American ships, older American ships, but nonetheless American ships. And then Mitchell will sink them and will send them all to the bottom, replicating what he had done in the summer of 1921 with Ostfriesland and the other German ships. What are the impacts of what he has done? What are the impacts of these 4 sinkings off of Virginia in the summer of 1921? Let's look at that, because this really is, this is where you draw the line. This is where you can still see the impacts of the tests even today. The impacts, the immediate impacts from the air perspective are very clear. It's a shot in the arm for the development of both air power and air forces, air units in the Army, but also in the Navy. Aviators feel validated. Army aviators use these arguments and use this momentum to get the Army Air Service created the Army Air Corps in 1925, which will later, of course, transform into the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1941 and then become the independent U.S. Air Force in 1947. So it's a tremendous shot in the arm for the development of Army aviation over time. It also spurs development on the Navy side as well. Marine aviators begin to realize the potential of ground support to ground troops. Naval aviators in particular realize that in the future, Mitchell has proven that air will be a part of naval warfare. The question is to what degree. But they also realize that land-based air will be a part of naval warfare when they're close to the coast. But when they're out in the middle of, say, the Pacific or the Atlantic, they're going to need air power with them as well. And so that spurs the development of aircraft carriers. It also spurs the development of naval aviation, spurs the first real aircraft carrier development, USS Langley, USS Lexington, USS Saratoga, and so on. All begin in the late 20s and all get a shot in the arm from what happened off the Virginia coast. And actually, Mitchell has his own part of this as well, because the naval aviators successfully argue the Navy better develop aircraft carriers, because if they don't, Billy Mitchell and the Army Air Corps are going to develop aircraft carriers, and the Navy doesn't want that. They don't want the Army involved in that, which I get. But it's a tremendous shot in the arm for naval aviation with effects that we'll see. As I talked about at the beginning, much went into these tests, much is flowing from these tests as well. And these are two major things that flow from the tests. And just to put a fine point on everything I just discussed, Admiral William Fulham, who had retired but was on the assessment board for the tests, will later write and will say, the fleet with superior air forces will no doubt win the next naval battle. He'll write that shortly after the tests. The Navy board that assessed the tests the day after the sinking of Ostfriesland will say, it is clear that the airplane, quote, is a powerful offensive weapon in war, unquote. When you take those two statements and you look forward 20 years to battles like Coral Sea, Midway, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, you realize they're absolutely right. The airplane is here to stay. It's going to be an important element for warfare, not just at sea, but warfare in general. I would argue right up to the present day. There are people that disagree. Many admirals, particularly surface fleet admirals, push back on the results' validity. They argue the ships aren't maneuvering. They weren't defending themselves. They weren't conducting damage control. Had they been doing all that, they either A, would have been able to dodge the bombs, B, they would have been able to survive any damage, or C, they would have been able to shoot down all of the attacking aircraft with their anti-aircraft weapons. Now, when you consider the technology, the air technology of 1921, those are probably legitimate questions and legitimate points to be brought up. But they become, particularly in the aviator's mind, they become less valid as the decades go on. And by the time you get to World War I, 1939, 1940, 1941, airplane technology, surface ship technology has changed too, but air technology has changed. For those of you who go to the Aviation Museum, just compare what's in the World War I hangar with what's compared with what's in the World War II hangar, and you'll get an idea of the dramatic change in airplane technology just over the 20-year period between the sinking of Ostfriesland and U.S. entry into World War II. Planes are faster, they're more maneuverable, they can deliver bombs more effectively, faster. It's a whole new ballgame. And so this assumption continues until it will no longer be true, which we'll see here in a second. But this assumption continues. And there are many people, I would argue even today, there are some people that when I talked about doing this talk, some of my colleagues said, oh, the 1921 tests were just a publicity stunt, had no real impact. I argue the opposite. And some of this is this lingering attitude here. The ships weren't maneuvering or defending themselves. It doesn't really prove anything. But the fact remains, the incontrovertible fact remained and remains. Those ships were sunk solely from the air, something that had not been done before. And that's the last thing I would point out on this slide, is that the tests foreshadow what happens in World War II. Mitchell's feat will be replicated in the future. And I want to walk through the time I have remaining before we open it for questions. I want to very quickly walk through those and demonstrate the evidence to the contrary that airplanes can in fact kill battleships. The first evidence, some of probably the better ones actually, because this was done by biplanes, Swordfish, was the attack on the Italian naval base at Taranto on the 11th of November 1940 by British planes. They knock out a significant part of the Italian fleet in an anchorage that was alerted and was defending itself. You can see the approach routes, and then the torpedo drops here do a real number on Italian battleships. So that's the raid on Taranto there in November of 1940. Again, against ships that are at anchor, granted, but they are defending themselves, they are conducting damage control, and they knock out a significant part of the Italian fleet. You can see damage to several battleships. You can see indicated here on the map. And then, of course, we come to Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese, who had studied the Taranto attack, by the way, and had gotten some inspiration for the attack on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. This is a photograph from a Japanese, it's probably a famous photograph many of you have seen from a Japanese attacker. This is Battleship Row here, USS Nevada. Here's USS Arizona, which has just minutes to live. And here's USS Oklahoma, which has already taken torpedo hits and is beginning to list to port. Of course, she'll roll over very shortly. As a matter of fact, they just, as a side note, they've been identifying unknowns, including several Wisconsin unknowns from the Oklahoma, remains that have been recovered after the ship had been raised and buried as unknowns in the punch bowl. They've been able to finally bring those guys home and bring them back fully identified. Again, a harbor that, granted, is caught by surprise, but does fight back and does, is conducting damage control as best it can. Granted, it is a surprise attack, but still meets some of the objections of the admirals that, it was just the tests don't matter. Well, in this case, you're getting similar results, different circumstances. And then we come to this just 3 days later. the first ships ever sunk while at sea, open sea, maneuvering and actively defending themselves. Force Z, because it's a Royal Navy. It's not Force Z because it's a Royal Navy formation. Force Z. HMS Repulse over here to the left, and HMS Prince of Wales over here to the right. Most modern battleship in the British fleet at the time is Prince of Wales, part of the King George V class. Battlecruiser Repulse is 25 years old, but a very modern ship. You can see she's just taken a level bombing attack by Japanese bombers. In 2.5 hours, Japanese bombers and torpedo planes sink first Repulse and then sink Prince of Wales. And so now you have what Mitchell foreshadowed has come to pass. Airplanes can knock out modern capital ships, battleships, battle cruisers. They've been able to knock out destroyers and cruisers. That had been proven in the Mediterranean in 1941 many times. But battleships had always been inviolate while defending themselves and in the open sea. Now they are no longer, that's no longer true. And so the airplane begins its ascendancy over the battleship by now. And if anybody had any doubt as to the days of the battleship are numbered, I will simply cite the 3 cases of the 3 most powerful Axis battleships afloat in the last year and a half of World War II. All 3 sunk solely by air power. First, Musashi, one of the most powerful battleships ever built, Yamato class, the Japanese, sunk by America. It took a lot of strikes, took a lot of bomb hits and torpedo hits to do it, but they did it. Musashi never fired on an opposing ship with her main armament. It was only American air power that sunk her in the central Philippines during the Battle of Leyte Gulf on the 24th of October, 1944. That is her in the foreground there. And you can see the ferocity of the American attack on her. But she will sink that evening as a result of the wounds from the bombs and the torpedo hits from American air power. A few weeks later, the German battleship Tirpitz, sister to the Bismarck, which had been sunk in 1941, crippled by air power, but ultimately sunk by the Royal Navy. Battleship Tirpitz, RAF Lancasters with big tall boy, 12,000-pound tall boy bombs dropping in and around her. Again, the water hammer effect, but also some direct hits on the deck. She rolls over and sinks in Trondheim Fjord in Norway. And this is one of the fatal hits on her on the 12th of November, 1944, taken from one of the British Lancasters. And last but not least, in many ways, the ultimate kamikaze on a one-way trip to Okinawa is one of the most powerful battleships, along with Musashi, ever built, the Japanese Yamato, on the 7th of April, 1945. There had been some question as to whether or not the battleship fleet of the U.S. Fifth Fleet should take her, or whether the air power should take her. And Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had spent his career until 1942 in surface ships, told the battleship admirals to stand down and told the air admiral, Mark Misher, who was Wisconsin born, by the way, you take him. And in a couple of hours, Yamato was sent to the bottom, her magazines exploding on the way, solely by American air power. And so these events from 1940 to 1945 demonstrate that what Mitchell had proven in 1921 is true. It's possible. And it marks the end of the battleship. After centuries as the primary arbiter of naval power, it marks the eclipse of the battleship. An event foreshadowed in 1921 has now come to pass. And that is a tremendous prophecy and a tremendous legacy of what happened off the Virginia Capes in the summer of 1921. Let me give you the last word. The sinking of Ostfriesland marked the beginning of what would be a slow end for battleships. We've just seen that over the last few slides. And then the Air Force official history of World War II, when they talk about the interwar period, said disputes arose as to the manner in which the experiment had been conducted. And the Joint Board's report from the Navy tended to deprecate the effectiveness of aerial bombing. But the fact of the sinkings was indisputable. And when you think about that last sentence, you realize arguably one of the most important shipwrecks in the last 100 years is Ostfriesland, because of what she symbolized, what she prophesied. The first battleship ever sunk solely by air power. It proved that air was an important element of warfare going forward. It proved and prophesied that naval warfare would look a lot different in the next conflict than it had in the last. And it gave a shot in the arm to the development of aviation, both from a U.S. Air Force, U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force perspective, but also from a Navy perspective as well. And in some ways, you can trace the legacy, the seeds that were planted in direct response to the 1921 tests have flowered, have borne fruit that are still with us today. And so when you think about what happened 100 years ago, it seems like a long time ago. It's really not. And certainly when you start to trace the impacts, trace what it inspired, what it guided, and what it continues to influence today, that makes what happened 100 years ago worthy of notice and worthy of reflection. And it was a Wisconsin aviator, I just have to mention that, sorry. It's a Wisconsin aviator who played an important role in making it happen. If you'd like to know more, here's a couple of things that I highly recommend. Douglas Waller's book, A Question of Loyalty, is primarily about the Billy Mitchell court martial, but it's also a very good basic biography of General Mitchell. Mitchell's book himself, The 1925 Wing Defense, includes his extensive account of the sinkings. The Navy History and Heritage Command on their website has outstanding pictures, some accounts, some official reports from the bombing, some contemporary accounts as well, and assessments. And then if you want to see what happened yourself, the test footage is actually on YouTube. I viewed it as part of preparation for this talk. Actually, was you can see Ostfriesland sink for yourself, and some of the other bombing runs against some of the other ships involved in the various tests as well. So I encourage you to take a look at those. At this point, I am going to open it for questions. I'd just like to thank everybody for being here. I really appreciate you taking time to learn this important history. And I would just say, if you haven't been down to Virginia Beach, go see the Aviation Museum. And certainly I would invite everybody, next time you're up in Madison, please come by and see us here at the Veterans Museum. But again, thank you all for your attention, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion. So Keegan, thanks a lot, and I'll throw it over to you.
Chris, thank you so much for that. What an incredible presentation and a walk through an important centennial event that's imminently upon us. So thank you so much for your time on that. I think what we would like to start out by doing is getting you to remind us all how we can support your museum and its efforts. I understand that you're at least still closed, I think, for a little while up there in Wisconsin, but maybe you can tell us, what the situation has been for you over the last year and what we can all do to support you.
No, I appreciate that. We've been closed for COVID-related reasons since March 15th of 2020, but we're doing a lot of behind-the-scenes things to refresh our exhibits and get some things done we've wanted to do for a while. So when we reopen, it's going to be a refreshed museum. The big thing we've been doing is we do a robust, much like tonight, we do a robust series of virtual programs. We do drink and draw, trivia. We do curator conversations about many different topics related to various aspects of military history from the Civil War to the present. And we do movie nights as well, a monthly movie night where we look at a military movie and discuss it, or a war-themed movie, military-themed movie, things like that, and a few other book talks and special programs. To find that and also find out how to support us through donations to our foundation, our partner foundation, the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation, you can either Google Wisconsin Veterans Museum, or our website is WisVets, WISVETS Museum, all one word, .com. So please do check us out. And like I said, we're free admission. Next time you're up in Madison, we're right on the Capitol Square. Come on by and please do see us.
And drink and draw certainly sounds like an interesting event, so I'm sure some of us will join you for that next time in the proud tradition of good Wisconsin beer. That being said, another question for you, kind of on the Wisconsin vein. There were a lot of cheeseheads came up in this discussion tonight. There was a lot of Wisconsin connections to different people who would become movers and shakers in the Air Force and in the different service branches going into World War II. Is there something in the water up there? Can you maybe talk about what service means to the community there in Wisconsin and why they've been, why so many of these guys pop up in these stories?
That's a great question, and I'll just this is a whole presentation in itself. There is something in the water up here. There's tremendous state pride, but also there's a tremendous sense of service to the community up here. And you'll find among many families great traditions, generations even of military service. I'll speak for myself. My mother's family settled here in 1845 from Switzerland, and in every generation up to the present, we have had at least one person in one branch or more of the military that have served. And my family is not alone by any stretch of the imagination. And so it's that ethos, that idea of getting out and being a part of something greater than you, that tends to draw people into military service. And some make it a career. The Twinings, for example, are from Wisconsin. Nathan Twining, later Chief of Staff of the Air Force. His brother Merrill was a Marine general, designed the 1st Marine Division patch, as a matter of fact. They're from Wisconsin. Billy Mitchell, of course, comes to mind. There are many, many others. One of the things that lends itself, Wisconsin has a great aviation history. Of course, many of you are probably familiar with the EAA museum that's up here in Oshkosh. There's several other great aviation museums up here. The flying conditions up here tend to be very good, and it's kind of wide open, and it's the weather tends to be fairly stable and predictable. And the flying conditions, they're just an aviation culture has developed up here really since the 1920s. And even today, very active aviation community here in Wisconsin. So, and I will say, I did make a point of picking out the Wisconsinites as I went. Was I director of another state's military museum, I'd probably find a way to highlight that state too. But there's no question that Wisconsinites have served, and continue to serve with great distinction in our country.
Chris, thank you for that. I think the comment about the culture of museums and aviation and everything up there is well made, obviously. I think it may have moved, but my most recent trip to Milwaukee was a couple years ago, and there's a great Mitchell Museum there in the airport, in the terminal in Milwaukee, if I remember right.
Still there. They have some of the general's items on display. If you have time when you're going, most people when they're passing through the airport kind of pass by it. But if you have time, I do recommend checking it out. It's very cool. 2 other airports, by the way, that have great military displays if you have time as you go through: the Chicago Midway, which has a great display on the Battle of Midway and has a Dauntless on display, by the way. I know you guys are restoring one now. And also O'Hare Airport, which is named, of course, for the flying ace Butch O'Hare. So if anybody's going through either of those major Chicago airports, those are some neat ones too. And of course, the Milwaukee airport's got a great display.
Got to find my way back to the unmute button. We've had a couple folks ask about torpedo bombing and skip bombing and the sort of strategy of actually bombing the ships. Torpedoes obviously are around. Submarines and motor torpedo boats used them in World War I.
Right.
Have they been made air mobile yet? Can you pick one up with an airplane at the time? And was skip bombing considered?
Those are great questions. Torpedoes are still somewhat in their infancy. The Navy is experimenting with aerial use of them. They intentionally excluded torpedo use because they didn't want to sink the ships fast. But the other thing is they didn't want Billy Mitchell to get his hands on torpedo technology. So there's some inter-service jealousy there, is why they chose to use bombing. Skip bombing, which is used to great effect in World War II, particularly with the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific. The equipment is not, Mitchell considered many different tactics to use: level bombing, skip bombing, many different tactics. The equipment they had it wasn't what it would be in World War II. Particularly, you need an aircraft that can fly quickly to generate enough momentum to actually skip the bomb along the water. Mitchell's aircraft, 175 miles an hour was the top speed, and that was the absolute fastest. Most of those bombers, when laden, would fly maybe 75% of that, if not less. So you just don't have the equipment or the bomb sites. And so Mitchell realized that the tactic that we need to use is dive bombing, because that's the only one that will give us the most accurate results that we're looking for. And so that's why they went with what they made. Again, those techniques, as technology develops over the next 15, 20 years after 1921, those techniques and those technologies, torpedoes, skip bombing will become much more possible and prevalent. But in 1921, they're still very much in their infancy, and a lot of it's limitation of equipment.
You mentioned inter-service rivalries. I'm sure that right after these tests, there was that wave of like, well, the test wasn't real and it didn't really happen that way. And as you mentioned, you couldn't possibly hit one that was maneuvering or defending itself. Can you maybe talk about what the surface fleet admirals did in terms of preparing to fend off attacks from the air? Were ships outfitted with more anti-aircraft guns as a result? Were damage control teams trained differently? Was there any kind of response at that operational level within the surface fleet?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes. You start to see it in warship design as you get into the 1930s. There are a couple of things that happen. First of all, damage control, which in the Navy has always been, if a ship is damaged, particularly if a ship is on fire, everybody is potentially a part of damage control. It just really puts a fine point on the need to do that. And so you'll see damage control really is a cult is too strong a word, but it becomes a real point of emphasis is a better way to put it in the Navy. It had always been anyway, but now it really is because of the threat from the air. There's an increase in anti-aircraft weaponry when they start, modifying ships, particularly to see this in action. Look at when they bring all the battleships like Pennsylvania, Arizona, the ones on Battleship Row, when they bring them in the early 30s for a refit. One of the things they get is they get improved anti-aircraft armor. And one of the other things that a lot of these get is they get increased armor on the sides of the ship and torpedo blisters installed on the sides of the ship to prevent against aerial torpedoes, but also surface launch torpedoes. One of the other things is modern battleships in the late 20s and early 30s, once the arm limitations treaties go away, begin to be built with what's called an armored citadel. Prince of Wales actually had an armored citadel, where the center part of the ship, where, for example, the magazines would be, kind of the essential kind of guts and brains of the ship, have an armored box that is built around it that extends all the way down to the keel. It makes the ships too heavy to do anything beyond basically the center vitals part of the ship. So the bow is relatively unarmored, so is the stern. But the creation of that armored citadel is in part a reaction to the water hammer tactic. And because remember, Ostfriesland hadn't been designed with underwater protection really in mind, except for shells, plunging shells. The idea of a water hammer, the idea of submarine torpedoes was not something the German designers had really reckoned with. Hopefully that came through.
To see if people have the opportunity to visit the USS Texas, it's a great ship to see because it is refitted during this time, and you can see where additional structure is added to the ship for exactly this reason.
Yep.
Chris, can you talk a little bit more about the Cape Hatteras tests and what exactly was aimed to be achieved with the further extension of the tests? There's a great exhibit down at the graveyard of the Atlantic Museum, and those of you who visited that region outside Cape Hatteras, the National Park Service has a cool miniature exhibit at the Billy Mitchell Aerodrome, which I guess is one of the launching off points for the attacks on the ships, the USS Virginia, and the other one slips my mind, but Chris, I'm sure you have it.
It's the USS New Jersey. And the Hatteras tests were designed to sink ships, but they were also designed to test range of aircraft. The ships are anchored further offshore, whereas destroyers had helped be navigation beacons for Mitchell's ships to find the German ships in 1921. In 1923, they are flying from Langley, stopping at the Billy Mitchell Field in Hatteras. So there's a navigation. You got to navigate to the field, stop, refuel, and then fly out and find the ships yourself, and then sink them. And so it's a test of, well, okay, we handed you the position of the German ships on the plate. Can you find these ships now, and can you sink them? And Mitchell proved that in fact was possible. It was a test. It was a test of the limits of air power, and kind of exploring further the possibilities of air power operating off a coast and navigating over water.
So we've had a couple people ask the question, and I think it's a really interesting one. Were there Japanese observers at this event? At what point did the Japanese kind of go all in on carrier-borne aircraft development? What drove that on their end of the Pacific Ocean that ultimately, brought them into the Second World War in kind of a really strong position in terms of overall number of fleet carriers, number of trained aviators, and the variety of kind of aircraft designed specifically for that role?
Sure, sure. No, that's a great question. There were no Japanese observers. This was an all US test. However, it's reported in the media, it's discussed in professional military circles. And so the Japanese would have gotten their hands on professional notes from this. We should not forget, too, that in the fall of 1921 is the Washington Naval Treaty arms limitation, in which the Japanese Navy has to scrap parts of their battleships that are under construction. There's no limitation in the 1921 treaty on aircraft carriers, however. And the Japanese at this point are assuming that they're going to have to fight the United States at some point in the Pacific within the next probably 20 years. And they turn to aircraft and aviation as a potential equalizer. One of the things that the treaty had done, and it was a source of irritation for the Japanese, was it had limited tonnage of Japanese. The British and the Americans were 100%. The Japanese were 60% of whatever the American and British tonnage was in battleships and capital ships. But there's no limit on aircraft carriers. There's no limit on cruisers, things like that. Can you hear me? I'm getting a note here that my
We can hear you all right. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I think we're good.
Okay, so the vagaries of the internet. So they turned to naval aviation as a way to kind of even the playing field and even the balance. And that's really why they turned the way that they turned. They're still interested in big battle wagons. Yamato and Musashi are perfect examples. But they view the airplane as a way to even the odds against the Americans when the decisive battle, as they term it, will be fought. Great question.
I think all of us were kind of surprised to find out just how quickly the submarine was sunk. Can you maybe speak to the operational altitude of the airplanes that were hitting these different ships? How high up were they? The picture of the Alabama, it almost looks like, they dropped that bomb 10 feet onto the masthead.
They were flying low. They were flying under 1,000 feet. 500 feet would be a high altitude. Most of the bombs, the dive bombs in particular, but even the level bombing was done below 300 feet. They would dive down and sometimes dive down as low as, well, as you could see from the Alabama, there'd be a dive run, and then they pull out just above the masthead height and then swoop up. So that's they're bombing from pretty low altitude. A submarine, though, remember too, is if you've toured any submarine that's one of the museum submarines, it's a fairly flimsy construction. The submarine shield is not necessarily the strength of the hull. The submarine shield is the amount of water it can put over itself quickly. And if a submarine is on the surface caught by an aircraft, it doesn't stand much of a chance if the aircraft can get a good either close miss or a good hit. The Germans learned that the hard way in World War II, as did many American submarines. If anybody wants to explore that further, I would encourage you to Google the wreck of the USS Wahoo and see the pictures of the wreck, and you'll see what a Japanese bomb did to the Wahoo in the Sea of Japan in 1943, and you'll get some idea of what I'm trying to convey.
Thank you for that. It's always good to have those extra sources to look up. Were they using any particular kind of bomb sight? That technology was relatively rudimentary at that point, or was it kind of an eyeballed operation?
It was part eyeball, and then they had some rudimentary aiming devices, kind of like the targets for the machine gun. They could line up the targets on the ship, and do that. It was very, very primitive. Something like the Norden bomb sight was not in existence yet. So it was just kind of primitive geometry and primitive targeting for what they were, for what they were doing. That's one of the big reasons they want a dive bomb, is because they realize the most accurate is not level bombing with the wind and everything. It's dive in, release, let the bomb travel the short distance. You can deliver very accurately in the dive, and then as you release, you pull out and come up. And that's why they use the tactic they do, is again, limitations of equipment.
So following on to the discussion of limitations of equipment, I think this will be our last question for the evening, Chris. You mentioned on one of your last slides that the end of the battleship was relatively slow in coming. It would take another 20 years for the battleship to really be truly out of it. Was that because of the Navy's conservative approach to preparations for future war, or because airplanes had to get better to truly finish off the battleship?
Honestly, I think it's both. I think it's both. Militaries in general, it's an old cliche that militaries try and fight the last war. That speaks to an inherent conservatism and an inherent inertia, particularly if you have weapon systems that are working fine at the time. You don't necessarily are not in a hurry to replace them or upgrade them. That applies to a great extent to the battleship fleet. It applies to other things as well. I can think of other examples. Plus, the airplane had to really. Mitchell demonstrated the potential of new technology, but it needed to catch up. Still needed development to truly get to where it needed to be to take the role that it would ultimately take. I would argue the same thing is true of the submarine. The CSS Hunley in Charleston. When it sinks the Housatonic in 1864, it's an interesting story. It's a daring attack, but it's another thing like that too, where it demonstrates the potential of the new technology. But you still need another 50 years of technological development for the submarine really to start to come into its own as a weapon. And so that's what 1921 is it foreshadows, it shows what the potential is, it shows what the likely future is, or what a likely factor will be in the future. But the technology is not there yet. It is by 1941, and it definitely is by 1945.
I think that's a great analogy to make, is to connect it to the Hunley. I think that's a story we're all kind of familiar with, that they just were pushing just a little past what could be accomplished with the technology of the era. So Chris, thank you again for spending your time with us this evening. Thank you everyone out there who joined us. It was our great pleasure to host everyone for this interesting look at a critical piece of history that sort of changed the way wars were fought 100 years ago. So Chris, thank you so much for being with us, and have a great rest of your evening.